Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer. We are about to embark on a truly staggering journey today. We're looking at a 3,000-year epic of faith, power, and the ultimate struggle for cultural survival. The history of Israel is the story of a tiny strip of land that became the absolute obsession of empires, the birthplace of major religions, and the spark of endless, shifting conflict. It's a story of profound destruction, but also of remarkable rebirth. To wrap our heads around millennia of really dense history, we've broken this explainer down into 5 main chapters. We'll start with ancient faiths and crossroads, move into empires, exile, and diaspora, then cover the rise of Zionism, followed by independence and regional wars, and finally, the modern geopolitical crucible. We're going to trace this timeline from its ancient roots all the way up to the modern gridlock we see today.
All right, so let's kick things off with Chapter 1, Ancient Faiths and Crossroads.
It's pretty fascinating to realize how much geography essentially dictated the destiny of this entire region. Right there, bordered by the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, ancient Canaan was literally the ultimate crossroads. It directly connected Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, and Mesopotamia. Because of those major trade routes and natural resources, it just became this incredibly diverse hub. You had Phoenician traders passing through, and hey, they actually gifted the world the phonetic alphabet that we're still using right now. And it was also home to Jericho. With defensive walls dating back 11 millennia, it's literally one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on the planet.
So out of this busy geographic hub, a really distinct national identity started to emerge. The early monotheistic traditions of the Israelites began taking actual political shape around the 11th century BC. Think about 1020 BC. King Saul steps up and unifies the 12 scattered tribes just to protect them from external threats, like the Philistines. Then we see some rapid leadership changes that really accelerate things. King David captures Jerusalem, kicking off what's remembered as a golden age. And right after him, King Solomon builds the massive first temple on Mount Moriah. Now, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that this temple centralized their religious identity. It permanently tied their early monotheistic faith to this specific, tiny piece of land.
Moving right along to Chapter 2, Empires, Exile, and Diaspora.
For centuries, this region was basically treated like a prize by a relentless cycle of massive empires. First, the Assyrians come in and completely shatter the north. Then, in 586 BC, the Babylonians brought just unimaginable devastation. They burned Jerusalem, destroyed that first temple, and literally forced the leaders into exile. Later on, the Persians conquer Babylon, and remarkably, they actually allow the Jewish people to return to Zion and rebuild. But the peace doesn't last. A few centuries later, Alexander the Great sweeps through, bringing this huge wave of Hellenistic culture. So every conqueror fractured the physical nation, right? But the fascinating part is that this intense, continuous pressure actually forced their cultural identity to adapt and somehow grow even stronger.
It's like a giant puzzle they had to put back together. The prophet Haggai famously urged the returning exiles to rebuild the temple, but the reality of their daily lives had already shifted profoundly. During their time in exile, and later under leaders like Ezra the scribe, the community had this realization. They couldn't just rely on a physical building that could be knocked down again. So they started codifying their oral traditions into written texts, the Torah. They began gathering in smaller, local spaces to pray and study, which eventually evolved into synagogues. This was a real game changer. This massive cultural adaptation meant their faith could survive absolutely anywhere in the world, without needing a central temple at all.
If we fast forward a bit, we see drastically different empires managing the insanely diverse religious customs of Jerusalem. The Crusader era, which started around 1099, was brutally exclusive. Crusaders massacred Jewish and Muslim inhabitants because they viewed the historical sanctity of Jerusalem as belonging solely to Western Christians. But then contrast that with the Mamluk and Ottoman eras later on. These Islamic empires generally encouraged trade and some really magnificent architectural growth. They rebuilt the city walls you can still walk on today. They practiced a relative religious tolerance, letting diverse communities live and worship there, though it's worth noting minorities did have to pay special, heavy taxes. It's just a stark look at how the 3 major religions interacted, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully, in one incredibly contested city over the centuries.
And that brings us to Chapter 3, the rise of Zionism.
So Zionism emerged in Europe during the 19th century, an age of rising nationalism all over the continent. But for the Jewish diaspora, this movement was driven by a terrifying, escalating wave of anti-Semitism.
We're talking about actual state-sanctioned terror in the Russian Empire with violent pogroms, and deeply rooted prejudice in Western Europe, famously highlighted by the Dreyfus Affair over in France. Zionism was a direct political reaction to that violence. It formalized the goal of securing a safe, sovereign Jewish homeland in the land of Israel.
The real visionary behind turning this widespread dream into a concrete strategy was a journalist named Theodor Herzl. Deeply shocked by the hatred he was witnessing in Europe, he organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland back in 1897. He was incredibly confident about it too. He famously said, "At Basel I founded the Jewish state, if not in 5 years, then certainly in 50. Herzl knew exactly what he was doing. He was planting the seeds for a highly organized political movement that would, quite literally, change the map of the world.
But long before Herzl's Congress even happened, the physical movement had already begun. This process is known as aliyah, which is a Hebrew word meaning ascent. Starting around 1882, the first waves of Jewish refugees fled the horrors of those European pogroms and arrived in what was then Ottoman-controlled Palestine. And the crucial thing to understand here is that it was not easy. Not at all. They faced incredibly harsh, unfamiliar climates, devastating diseases, and understandably resistance from the local Arab populations who were already living there. Yet, funded by European philanthropists, they drained swamps, built agricultural settlements, and physically started planting roots for a future nation.
Let's jump into Chapter 4, Independence and Regional Wars.
The entire geopolitical landscape of the world was fundamentally altered by the greatest evil of the 20th century. During World War II, Nazi Germany enacted the Holocaust, a systematic, state-sponsored genocide. For the Jewish people, this catastrophic devastation proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that assimilation in Europe had completely failed. It made the establishment of a sovereign refuge not just a political aspiration anymore. It became an absolute, desperate necessity for survival.
6 million. That is the staggering death toll of Jewish men, women, and children murdered during the Holocaust. When the war finally ended, hundreds of thousands of traumatized survivors were just left languishing in displaced persons camps. The sheer scale of this trauma convinced the survivors and, frankly, a huge chunk of the international community that having an independent state was literally the only guarantee for their future protection.
So, in an attempt to solve the escalating crisis in British-mandated Palestine, the United Nations stepped in with the 1947 Partition Plan. And the reactions to this? Diametrically opposed. From the Jewish perspective, the plan, which divided the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state, was accepted. They saw it as a painful but completely necessary compromise to finally get an internationally recognized state. But from the Arab perspective, the plan was fiercely rejected. They viewed it as just another colonial division imposed by outside powers and an unjust attack on a homeland that they had inhabited for generations.
When the British formally withdrew and David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel in 1948, a massive regional war immediately broke out. Now, while Israel fought for and secured its survival, the conflict resulted in a profound tragedy for the local Arab population. This massive displacement is known as the Nakba, an Arabic word meaning catastrophe. Over 750,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes. Hundreds of villages were destroyed. This created a lasting refugee crisis and a massive demographic shift, and the trauma of that displacement remains a core, unresolved element of the conflict to this very day.
What followed was just a grueling series of epic struggles for survival that constantly redrew the map of the entire Middle East. In 1948, Israel secured its statehood against combined Arab armies. In 1956, the Suez Crisis proved their military might but brought some serious diplomatic backlash. Then came 1967, the Six-Day War. In literally just 6 days, a preemptive Israeli strike resulted in the capture of the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. This fundamentally altered the region's balance of power. Finally, the surprise attack of the 1973 Yom Kippur War brought incredibly heavy losses to everyone involved. It was a wake-up call, forcing leadership on all sides to realize that endless war was just unsustainable, eventually paving the way for the very first diplomatic peace treaties.
And that brings us to our final chapter, Chapter 5, The Modern Geopolitical Crucible. Okay, let's dive into the most significant attempt at modern peace. Back in 1993, the Oslo Accords were negotiated in total secrecy in Norway. It was a historic moment, no doubt about it. You had Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat actually shaking hands. Israel officially recognized the PLO, and the Palestinian Authority was established to provide limited autonomy. However, this peace was deeply, heavily flawed. The core existential issues, things like who actually controls Jerusalem, exact borders, and the right of return for refugees, were left completely disputed and unresolved.
But here's where things take a really fascinating turn. While geopolitics completely stalled, something incredible was happening with Israel's economy. And this brilliantly illustrates how necessity breeds innovation. Surrounded by hostile neighbors and facing severe regional trade boycotts, Israel was forced into total self-reliance. They poured heavy investments into human capital, government research, and the private sector. That severe isolation actually catalyzed their transformation into a global startup nation. They started developing cutting-edge, necessity-driven technology. Perhaps the most famous example is the Iron Dome missile defense system, a literal technological marvel born out of the absolute, immediate necessity for security.
Yet, despite all this massive economic and technological progress, the reality on the ground today remains a deeply contested gridlock. Conflicts over the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza continue to spark repeated, devastating cycles of violence. Trust between Israelis and Palestinians is remarkably low, which makes sense given the decades of uprisings, barrier walls, and ongoing proxy conflicts. To make matters even more complicated, the geopolitical landscape is overshadowed by rising existential threats from nations like Iran and its continued support for militant groups right across Israel's borders.
So, after looking at all of this, we really have to ask ourselves, can ancient traditions and modern innovations truly coexist with the reality of unending geopolitical conflict? We've just walked through 3 millennia of incredibly dense history. We've seen a nation built on ancient monotheistic traditions, shaped by the massive cultural adaptations of the diaspora, and reborn through modern, cutting-edge technological innovation, but they are still fighting for their physical and cultural survival every single day. Can a society actually continuously thrive under the immense weight of that kind of relentless pressure?
That, my friends, is the ultimate question. The history of this land is an awe-inspiring and so often tragic cycle of destruction and rebirth. Will this historical cycle ever truly find lasting peace, or is the crucible just destined to continue? It's an incredibly complex, challenging reality, but understanding its deep historical roots is absolutely the only way to make sense of the present. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.